Welcome back, everybody, to another week of Sunday school here at the Lighthouse Church of the Nazarene in Moravia, Iowa, where we're going through the book of Esther. This week, we're going to finish the book of Esther. We're going to do chapters 9 and chapters 10 today. Chapter 10 only has 3 verses, so it won't take long, and there's no point in doing a whole day just for 3 verses. So, as today is the day that we're going to finish the book of Esther, today is also the day that the Jews have been preparing for. The main theme of the book of Esther is that God provides and protects his people. There was a man named Haman who was a descendant of the Agagites, the Amalekites, who wanted to wipe the Jews off the face of the earth. But anyway, he is now dead, but his decree is still there, and they're still enemies of the Jews. And so today is the day that they're going to attack, and the Jews have a decree that they can fend themselves. So let's see what happens. We're in the book of Esther, Esther 9, chapter 1. Let's get out our Bibles and let's follow along. Esther 9, verse 1. Now in the 12th month, that is the month of Adar, on the 13th day, the time came for the king's command and his decree to be executed. On that day, the enemies of the Jews had hoped to overpower them. The opposite occurred, in that the Jews themselves overpowered those who hated them. As I said, the main theme of the book of Esther is that God provides and protects his people. The Bible says, if God is for us, who can be against us? Romans 8:31. When you have God on your side, you really cannot lose. This was a rigged game from the beginning. It's interesting. In Acts chapter 5, there's a man named Gamaliel who gives advice to the Pharisees. And he says, if this Jesus, if he's from God, leave it alone, because even you don't want to be fighting against God. That's what these enemies of the Jews were doing here. They were fighting against God. So it was a rigged game. You and I, we're also playing a rigged game because we've read the book. We know how it ends. We know that God wins, correct? I've heard it said, one with God is a majority. And that's where the Jews found themselves right here. Verse 2, the Jews gathered together in their cities throughout all the provinces of King Ahasuerus to lay hands on those who sought their harm. Remember, this was from India to Ethiopia, 127 provinces. This all took place across the whole kingdom. And no one could withstand them because fear of them fell upon all the people. We've seen this phrase in the Bible before. The fear of them fell across all the land. It's interesting. In the book of Joshua, when the Israelites came into the promised land, it said that the fear of them fell across all the land. In fact, Rahab, she told the spies, she said, we're all scared of you. We know we can't stand against you. That's one of the problems with the world today. There is no fear of God. The Apostle Paul says that in Romans 3:18. He says there's no fear of the Lord before their eyes. In the book of Exodus, when Moses tells Pharaoh, God says, let my people go. Do you know how Pharaoh responds? He says, who is this God and why should I fear him? Too many people today have that sort of attitude against God. Who is this God and why should I fear him? We need to have more fear of God across all the land. So verse 3, and all the officials of the provinces, the satraps, the governors, and all those doing the king's work helped the Jews because the fear of Mordecai fell upon them. Verse 4, for Mordecai was great in the king's palace, and his fame spread throughout all the provinces. For this man Mordecai became increasingly prominent. The Lord brought Mordecai up to a place of prominence, just as he did with Joseph in Egypt, just as he did with Daniel in Babylon. It's interesting. Daniel 2:21, God says, he removes kings and he raises up kings. God raised Mordecai up from just a lonely worker at the gate to now he's second in command across all the land. Verse 5. Thus the Jews defeated all their enemies with the stroke of the sword, with the slaughter and destruction, and did what they pleased with those who hated them. Verse 6, and in Shushan, the citadel, the Jews killed and destroyed 500 men. Also, Parshandatha, Dolphin, Asaptha, Paratha, Adalia, Ardatha, Parmesan, Ariza, Arida, and Vasatha, the 10 sons of Haman, the son of Hammedatha, the enemies of the Jews, they killed, but they did not lay hands on the plunder. It's interesting. These are the 10 sons of Haman right here. The 10 sons of Haman, they probably wanted to avenge their father's death. Their father Haman, he had a deep hatred for the Jews. He probably instilled it in his sons also. And so his 10 sons, they were probably plotting, saying, we got to get them back for what they did right there. But we need to know this. The Jews were not the aggressors. They were simply in self-preservation mode. And do you notice at the end here it says they did not lay hand on the plunder? 3 times in this chapter, it's going to tell us they did not lay hands on the plunder. Even if you go back to chapter 8, the decree says they could lay hands on the plunder and they could kill women and children. But they definitely did not, because if you see in verse 6, it says they killed 500 men, so they only killed the men, and they didn't lay hands on the plunder. They left the plunder so that all the new widows and orphans would have something to live off of. Jewish tradition says Haman's wife, her name was Zeresh. Jewish tradition says that she spent the rest of her life as a beggar. We don't find that in the Bible, though, but that's what Jewish tradition says. So Haman was killed in the end of chapter 7, impaled on a pole. These 10 sons of Haman's, they are also now dead. Verse 11. On that day, the number of those who were killed in Shushan the citadel was brought to the king. And the king said to Queen Esther, the Jews have killed and destroyed 500 men in Shushan the citadel and the 10 sons of Haman. What have they done in the rest of the king's provinces? Now, what is your petition? It shall be granted to you. Or what is your further request? It shall be done. So the king's telling Esther, what else do you need to do? Verse 13, then Esther said, if it pleases the king, let it be granted to the Jews who are in Shushan to do again tomorrow, according to today's decree, and let Haman's 10 sons be hanged on the gallows. Now, it's interesting here. These 10 sons, they're already dead. It seems kind of vengeful for Esther to say these 10 sons, let's also hang them. But why would she do that? I'd say she probably wanted to make examples of them, probably warnings to deter anyone else who wanted to take any future actions against the Jews. I would say that that's why Esther wanted to hang these 10 sons after they're already dead. But notice also this. She says, can we do this again tomorrow? Why do they have to do it again tomorrow? Because the threat is not over. There's a lesson for here. The enemy never stops. We have 2 enemies, correct? We have one enemy, Satan. The Bible tells us he walks about like a roaring lion, seeking whom he may devour. And if you don't take Satan serious, you're not reading your Bible. Jesus said, I saw Satan fall like heaven from lightning. He makes accusations against us before the Lord. He walks about like a roaring lion. He exists and he's real. And if you think he's just something fictitious, you're not reading your Bible. But we also have another enemy. And what's that enemy? The flesh, the old man, and the natural bend to sin. And it's always trying to come out. And we have to push it down. That's why the Apostle Paul said, I die daily. The Bible tells us those who are Christ have crucified the flesh with its passions and desires. Jesus told us that we have to daily take up our cross and follow him. Remember, the enemy never stops. The old man, the flesh, the natural bend to sin, it's always waiting to come out, and we always have to be at war against it. Verse 14. So the king commanded this to be done. The decree was issued in Shushan, and they hanged Haman's 10 sons. And the Jews who were in Shushan gathered together on the 14th day of the month of Adar and killed 300 men. So the first day they killed 500. There was still 300 left that hated them at least. But they did not lay hands on the plunder. Again, it says they did not lay hands on the plunder. Verse 16, the remainder of the Jews in the king's provinces gathered together and protected their lives, had rest from their enemies, and they killed 75,000 of their enemies, but they did not lay hand on the plunder. This was on the 13th day of the month of Adar, and on the 14th of the month they rested and made it a day of feasting and gladness. Now this is interesting. If you go back to the 17th chapter of Exodus, we find the Israelites at war against Amalek. And the Amalekites attacked them, and this is, if you remember, this is where Moses had to hold up the rod of God. And as long as he was holding it up, the Israelites were winning, but when it came down, they started losing. So Aaron and Hur stood on both sides of him and held it up. And then God said something very interesting after that battle. And it's Exodus 17:14. God said, I will utterly blot out the remembrance of Amalek from under heaven. Can I tell you that this was just fulfilled right here? These were the Amalekites coming to attack them. Haman and his 10 sons, they were descendants of the Amalekites. That Exodus 17:14 was fulfilled right here. When should it have been fulfilled? It should have been fulfilled under King Saul when Samuel told King Saul to do it. But Saul didn't do it. But guess who accomplished it? Mordecai. One more interesting thing, and this is kind of advanced placement Bible study right here. Mordecai, if you go back to Esther chapter 2, verse 5 and 6, it tells us that Mordecai was of the tribe of Benjamin, a descendant of Kish. Do you know who else was a son of Kish from the tribe of Benjamin? King Saul, the one that should have eradicated the Amalekites. So it seems like Mordecai just finished the job that his ancestor was supposed to do. Also, Saul, he plundered the loot. Did these Israelites here plunder the loot? Absolutely not. They didn't touch it. Just some interesting stuff that I really enjoy digging into this. So let's keep going here. Verse 18. But the Jews who were at Shushan assembled together on the 13th day as well as the 14th day, and on the 15th of the month they rested and made it a day of feasting and gladness. Therefore, the Jews of the villages who dwelled in the unwalled towns celebrated the 14th day of the month of Adar with gladness and feasting as a holiday for sending presents to one another. It seems like the Jews in the city and the country fought on different days. I'm not quite sure how to read this right here. All right, so then let's keep reading here. We're almost done. Verse 20, and Mordecai wrote these things and sent letters to all the Jews near and far who were in all the provinces of King Ahasuerus, to establish among them that they should celebrate yearly the 14th and 15th day of the month of Adar, as the days on which the Jews had rest from their enemies, as the month which was turned from sorrow to joy for them, and from mourning to a holiday, that they should make them days of feasting and joy, of sending presents to one another and gifts to the poor. So the Jews accepted the custom which they had begun, as Mordecai had written to them, because Haman, the son of Hammedatha, the Agagite, the enemy of all the Jews, had plotted against the Jews to annihilate them, and had cast pur, that is, the lot, to consume them and destroy them. But when Esther came before the king, he commanded by letter that this wicked plot which Haman had devised against the Jews should return on his own head, and that his son should be hanged on the gallows. So they called these days Purim, after the name Pur. Therefore, because all the words of this letter which they had seen concerning this matter and what had happened to them, the Jews established and imposed it upon themselves and their descendants and all those who would join them, that without fail they should celebrate these 2 days every year according to the written instruction and according to the prescribed time, that these days should be remembered and kept throughout every generation, every family, every province, and every city, that these days of Purim should not fail to be observed among the Jews, and that the memory of them should not perish among their descendants. All right, we read a lot there without talking about, but what just happened right here? This is where we just established the Feast of Purim. Now, what is Pur? Pur is the Persian word for lot. They cast the lots, the dice. That's how they would just... So Pur is the Persian word for lot. Purim, it's just the plural form. It's just the plural word of Purim. So right here is where they established the Feast of Purim. This yearly festival, it's actually coming up pretty quick, March 6th and 7th this year. What do they do at the Feast of Purim? Well, they read from the book of Esther. They also actually read Exodus chapter 17, their victory over the Amalekites, but they read the book of Esther. And when they read the book of Esther, every time the name Haman comes up, they boo and hiss and they say, "Cursed be Haman." And the kids actually have noisemakers and they make a bunch of noise every time the name Haman comes up. And every time the name Mordecai comes up, they cheer gladly and they say, "Blessed be the name of Mordecai." You ought to look up pictures of the Purim feasts on the internet. Nowadays, they actually dress up in costumes and they have parades and they give out candy to people. Actually, a lot of the Jews, I'm not going to say a lot because I really don't know this, but some of them drink a lot and actually get drunk on the Purim. They actually turn it into a drinking game where every time the name Haman comes up, they say, "Cursed be Haman," and they take a drink. And every time Mordecai comes up, they say, "Blessed be Mordecai," and they take a drink. And they're supposed to, I guess there was a rabbi at one time that said they were supposed to drink so much that they couldn't tell the difference between good and evil. I don't know about all that. But anyway, that is where the Feast of Purim is established right here. This happened, I think, in 430 BC. So for almost the past 2,500 years, they have kept this feast going right here. What can we take away from this? Actually, first of all, what you don't write down, you forget. I've heard it said, those who don't remember the past are doomed to repeat it. What you don't write down, you forget. They were commanded, pass this story on, how God provided for his people to every generation here on after. We also need to remember this. What we don't pass on to our next generation, it'll be lost, whether it comes to God and what he's done for us or whether it comes to our country and the sacrifices that those people made. If we don't pass it down, it'll be lost. Think about this. Why do we partake in communion? Jesus said, this bread that I break is my body. Do this often in remembrance of me. The Apostle Paul said, as often as you eat this bread and drink this cup, you proclaim the Lord's death until his return. That's what communion is. We're just remembering what Jesus did for us. All right, so the Feast of Purim is established right here. They still keep it to this day. Verse 29, then Queen Esther, the daughter of Abihail, with Mordecai the Jew, wrote with full authority to confirm this second letter about Purim. And Mordecai sent letters to all the Jews, to the 127 provinces of the kingdom of Ahasuerus, with words of peace and truth, to confirm these days of Purim at their appointed time, as Mordecai the Jew and Queen Esther had prescribed for them, and as they had decreed for themselves and their descendants concerning matters of their feasting and lamenting. Verse 32, so the decree of Esther confirmed these matters of Purim, and it was written in this book. And King Ahasuerus imposed tribute on the land and on the islands of the seas. Now all the acts of his power and his might, and the account of the greatness of Mordecai, to which the king advanced him, are they not written in the book of Chronicles for the kings of the Media and Persia? For Mordecai the Jew was second in command to King Ahasuerus. King Ahasuerus is actually going to be assassinated sometime soon here, and was great among the Jews, and well received by the multitude of his brethren, seeking the good of his people and speaking peace to all his countrymen. And they all lived happily ever after. We're done with the book of Esther. So what are some main points that we can take away from the book of Esther? The first one, I got this. God allows his people to go through trials and be tested, sometimes severely. I wouldn't have wanted to have to go through what Mordecai went through, but trials are just part of God's designs, and we should not suppose that we are protected from them just because we're followers of God. So trials, tests, they're just a part of life. Another thing we need to do, we need to remember what God has done for us. Even in our own churches, we need to remember the sacrifices that somebody stood up to plant a church here, and all the money and sacrifice that went up into it. And we need to keep pouring into that. And the last thing that we need to remember from the book of Esther is God is in control. The prophet Isaiah, when he saw the vision of God, what was God doing? He was sitting on the throne. God is in control at all times. Even when we're worried he's not, God is in control. So we're done with the book of Esther. Next week, we're going to go right into the book of Job. I'm looking forward to it. So hope you enjoyed it. I hope you learned something, and I'll see you the same time, same place next week. Bye.